All right, welcome to Rockford Reading Daily, episode 106. We are continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austen, and we're a little more than halfway through, or at just about halfway through the book. Annie Ricks settled into her fifth floor apartment in 660 West Division with her kids and her mother. Annie Ricks refused at first to send her children to the schools in her new neighborhood. Every morning, she put them on a bus and train back to the west side, an hour-long journey each way. Quote, I knew the area, end quote, she would say of the west side, so it seemed safer, more manageable. Quote, I didn't know anything about Cabrini, end quote. But at Schiller, the principal welcomed Annie, assuring her that the Ricks children were going to love it there. He was right. They did love it. Ricks was soon volunteering in their classrooms. From the time she was a little girl in Alabama, she'd wanted to be a teacher. One of her cousins, already in Chicago, had a job in a public school, and that's what Ricks hoped to do too. And when she was hired as a teacher's aide at one of the Cabrini-Green neighborhood schools, it was a dream come true, of sorts. That was just one of her jobs. Annie also managed an after-school program through a local church. At 3 o'clock, she'd leave the elementary school, pick up art supplies and softballs, and lead 24 children from her building to the blacktop. She'd shepherd the kids on long walks as far as the beaches at Navy Pier, warning them that if they acted up, she would never take them anywhere again. She babysat neighbors' children and worked at another local organization as well, running sports programs and helping Al Carter with his Cabrini-Green Olympics. Over the summers, she served free lunches out of the park by the high-rise. Ricks took her own children across Cabrini-Green for further tutoring at the old Montgomery Ward headquarters. They went to after-school programs in the neighborhood churches and youth centers, and Ricks rarely missed one of their games. The Ricks were a basketball family, the girls as well as the boys starring on their teams. With 13 of them, Ricks' children filled out entire squads in pickup games at Seward Park. Her older children met Scottie Pippen when the Bulls star paid to renovate the basketball courts at Durso Park. Ricks gave birth to Rose during the Bulls' third NBA Finals series in 1993 and to Raymond during one of the subsequent repeats. Annie's days at Cabrini-Green were long. At home, Ricks might fool around and wrestle with her children. She loved the professional wrestlers Dick the Bruiser and Baron Von Raschke, and Ricks and her children would put one another in headlocks and deliver flying elbow smashes. Then, many nights, she'd head out for a marathon walk. She'd leave the house, maybe not to return for hours, venturing off to Kmart or grocery stores miles away. She'd wander by the lake, or she'd retrace her path the first time she came to Cabrini-Green, hiking the trail back to the west side, visiting with one family member or another still living there. Quote, Mama, you need to stay in the house sometime, end quote, Kenosha or Latasha or Ernestine might say to her. Quote, who are you talking to? You're not my mama, end quote, Ricks would answer in mock anger. Other nights, Ricks would stay home and barbecue on the ramp, neighbors' children asking if they could have a plate. Of course, she would tell them, just as soon as she fed her own kids. Quote, we all got along like one big family, end quote, Ricks liked to say. The refrain, repeated often by Cabrini-Green residents, was hard to comprehend for outsiders. But neighbors who were like family also hurt one another. Shooting sometimes started while Annie had her after-school classes on the blacktop, and she made the children lie flat, hurting them in twos and threes back inside the building. Ricks helped her sister get an apartment on the same floor as her, and one day she was visiting when they heard gunshots. Two boys had fired into Annie's apartment window from the open-air walkway. Her son Raekwon was a toddler at the time, and he was playing by the elevators with Kenosha and another girl when it happened. Kenosha huddled the little ones into a corner so they didn't get hurt. But Annie's nephew, who was in his 20s, was inside the apartment, and she found him splayed on the ground, his body outlined in blood and glass. 2 shots from 2 different guns had entered his stomach. The paramedics wouldn't come at first. They didn't think it safe. When her nephew was finally taken to the hospital, he died twice. Both times his heart stopped, and he was jolted back to life. Quote, God wouldn't let him die, end quote, Ricks would say. She knew the shooters, along with their brothers and aunts and cousins, and had heard they were jealous of her nephew because he had a job in a new Chevy. One of the gunmen was later shot himself in an unrelated incident, and he was paralyzed from the waist down. Ricks would see his family carting him around in a wheelchair. Quote, I didn't care about the shooting after a while because I got used to the shooting, end quote, Ricks would say. Quote, I fear no man, no woman, I fear only God, end quote. And that brings us to a changing of the theme in that chapter. And I think what stands out to me there is the violence that becomes the violence that people become accustomed to because they don't have the options to just leave these neighborhoods and go live somewhere else. They don't have the option. All right, that last section got cut off a little bit abruptly. Sorry about that. I'm going to keep reading though. Fear is what brought Bernard Rose to Cabrini-Green. A Londoner, he wrote and directed the 1992 horror movie Candyman, adapting the script from a Clive Barker short story that takes place at a Liverpool public housing estate. When Rose arrived in Chicago, unsure where in the city to set his movie, the guys at the municipal film office told him they knew the place. But they said it was impossible to go there without a police escort. Security detail in tow, Rose roamed one of the Cabrini high-rises. He saw murky stairwells, the caves of apartments blackened by fires, entire floors sealed off and abandoned. Quote, there was something obviously spooky about that, end quote, he recalled. He understood that dangerous things happened there, but he also spent time with people like the Rickses, families who were eating dinner, doing homework, and watching television. It felt too like everyday life. Quote, the fear around Cabrini was irrational, end quote, Rose concluded. It colored every thought people had about the place, blotting out all else, which, for Candyman, at least, was perfect. Horror is all about the uncertainty between what's actual and imagined when the danger can't be seen. In the instant before the anticipated attack in the shadows of the unknown, terror requires that stories of menace flood the blank spaces of the mind. Quote, the old dark house on the hill has always been the standard setting of horror, end quote, Rose explained. Quote, but it seemed to me that the big public housing project was the new venue of terror, end quote. Helen, the protagonist of Rose's movie, is a white graduate student in Chicago researching urban legends. She is looking into the myth of the Candyman, a hooked-handed apparition who appears when his name is uttered 5 times. A black cleaning woman at the university, overhearing one of Helen's interviews, says she's from the South Side, not the near North Side, but she has a friend who has a cousin who's from Cabrini-Green, and she says everyone there is scared of the Candyman once it gets dark. This supernatural murderer is rumored to keep a lair inside a block of vacant high-rise apartments. In a film about the hazy boundaries between myth and reality, the fourth-hand information is appropriately vague. It's enough, though, to send Helen to newspaper archives, where she finds reports of other violent crimes at Cabrini-Green attributed to the phantasm, and then into one of the towers. Helen comes to understand, at least in the movie's mortal sense, that the residents tell tales of the monster as a means to comprehend the incomprehensible brutality of their existence. What else could possibly account for the squalor and isolation and violence in which they live? A societal plot to kill off black people? Utter indifference? Self-inflicted suffering? Why not the Candyman? In this way, the Candyman bears little resemblance to the witch who was said to haunt the barrens along the Ogden Avenue Bridge during Kelvin Cannon's youth. That bit of folklore was evoked to keep children safely inside their homes at the housing development. Candyman was the physical expression of public housing itself as the threat. But Candyman is more about what Cabrini-Green means to those who don't live there. Quote, just as urban legends are based on the real fears of those who believe in them, so are certain urban locations able to embody fear, end quote, the critic Roger Ebert wrote of Cabrini-Green in his 3 out of 4 star review of Candyman in the fall of 1992. The movie's opening images are of Chicago in the colorless gray of early winter as shot from the sky. The contrapuntal, excuse me, I might be probably pronouncing that wrong. The contrapuntal piano and organ of Philip Glass's score adding to the ominous effect. The vision of the city is not of a post-industrial dystopia with burning cars or darkish hordes. This isn't Escape from New York or Colors. Instead, we look down on the repeating tines of skyscrapers, lifeless in their geometric uniformity and drabness. The aerial shot travels toward Cabrini-Green. The sprawling public housing towers aren't distant outliers. From above, they're not unlike other buildings near them. And that's the point. Wherever you are in the inner city, the danger of Cabrini-Green is always in striking distance. The movie references a real-life crime that occurred in Chicago public housing, in which a man was able to enter a neighboring high-rise apartment through connected bathroom vanities so cheaply constructed that he simply pushed in the mirrors to create a passageway. Helen goes into the bathroom in her own high-rise condominium and discovers that she, too, can peel off her mirror to enter the apartment behind hers. She learns that her building was originally part of Cabrini-Green. The projects are coming from inside the house. Starting in 1990, Chicago's population began to inch up, the first increase in 40 years. The near North Side saw an influx of 4,000 white residents, and the area's median income jumped from a quarter of the city average to twice it during the 1980s. The number of building permits more than quadrupled. Vacant lots that had sold for $30,000 a decade earlier were being snapped up for 4 or 5 times that amount. For the young white professionals who chose to live in the city center, the threat of the ghetto was no longer a story of a far-off place. They now inhabited, quote, transitioning, end quote, neighborhoods. Movies such as Martin Scorsese's 1985 comedy After Hours tapped into a phobia held by this new yuppie class. A white office worker finds himself marooned in a yet-to-be gentrified section of downtown Manhattan. Quote, "None of us is safe," end quote, one of the endless tabloid headlines blared during the hysteria around the Central Park jogger case. When Jane Byrne moved into Cabrini-Green, 6 blocks from her Gold Coast home, she called their housing project, quote, "a cancer that can spread to every neighborhood in the city," end quote. In the spring of 1992, the idea that violence and disorder of the slums could infect a whole city was being demonstrated elsewhere. As Candyman was being worked on at a Hollywood studio, rioting erupted in Los Angeles following the not guilty verdict of 4 police officers caught on video beating the black motorist Rodney King. A sound engineer doing a rough mix of the movie switched between the filmed scenes of Cabrini-Green and the televised images of young men running in the streets in South Central. Quote, "I'm sorry, I can't do it anymore," end quote, he told Rose as he packed up his bags and fled for home. In adapting the Candyman script, Rose created an elaborate backstory for his killer that tapped into numerous racial tropes. As a corporeal being, Candyman was a gifted portrait artist, the son of a slave at the turn of the 19th century whose father earned a fortune after the Civil War by inventing a means to mass-produce shoes. Candyman fell in love with and impregnated one of his subjects, a white woman, and the girl's father hired thugs to lynch him, chasing him to Cabrini-Green, which did not exist, sawing off his painting can before setting him on fire. In his reincarnated form, Candyman appears in the film gaunt-cheeked and dark-skinned, towering in a fur-lined trench coat, possibly as hell-bent on miscegenation, Helen is a dead ringer for his postbellum love, as on murder. In one of the movie's most frightening scenes, Helen investigates the Cabrini-Green site where legend has it Candyman disemboweled a victim. The setting is the ultimate urban nightmare, a men's public toilet at a giant inner-city housing project. The toilet's tiny, freestanding building sits alone on the concrete plaza between the red high-rises, like a decaying shrub overshadowed by giant conifers. It is as much on display for thousands of unseen apartment dwellers as it is abandoned. By herself, of course, Helen enters the public bathroom. Spray-painted threats and indecipherable hieroglyphs cover every surface. She snaps away with the camera for her research. In search of answers, she peers into one stall and gags on the smell. She enters another. The toilets are cracked, overrun, coated in grime. At the last stall, she sees graffiti that seems to be a clue. She looks a little closer, lifting the toilet seat, and recoils. She turns, and a young man is standing there, filling the small space, blocking her exit. He wears a leather trench coat and holds in his hand a metal hook. 3 other guys join him, and one of them grabs Helen from behind. Quote, I hear you're looking for Candyman, bitch, end quote, the first one says flatly. Quote, well, you found him, end quote. Then he takes the blunt end of the hook and knocks Helen unconscious. The movie at this moment captures some of the true horror and the casualness and banality of the violence at Cabrini-Green. This isn't monster stuff. A guy from the buildings has been appropriating the Candyman myth to prop up his own reputation. Like the shooting into Annie Rick's apartment that almost killed her nephew twice, it's another routine act amid the city's grinding poverty. The scene ends with the four young men sauntering off, the long camera shot taking in their relaxed stride, the surrounding Cabrini Towers, and the downtown Chicago skyline in the near distance. Okay, that brings us to a changing of the theme in that chapter. And coincidentally, there was just a new Candyman that was released. Hold on, let me try to do something with this wire, man. Hope I wasn't making too much noise during the recording. Okay, coincidentally, there was just a new Candyman that was released at the end of last year, I believe, and some of the complaints from people after that came out was about some of the tropes and some of the stereotypes that were attributed in that movie to black people and to public housing and to things of that nature. And that just brings us again to something that we've talked about multiple times in here. We spoke about it or multiple times on this podcast. We spoke about it while reading this when we read about Good Times. We spoke about it when reading Women, Race, and Class, when talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that is just the balancing out the pros that come from highlighting social issues that exist when you through entertainment and through art, and the kinds of reproducing stereotypes and negative tropes that exist when you're creating that art. And so that stands out to me about the Candyman film. I'm not a big horror movie guy, so I've when I was younger, I watched like pieces of the original Candyman movie, but I can't like recall it all the way through. The Candyman, saying Candyman in the mirror 5 times is something that is a pretty common thing, a pretty common urban legend. I didn't see the new Candyman that was created either. I'm not really big into horror movies. But also in here, we read about small sections about the Rodney King, not Rodney King verdict, but the police officers who were found not guilty after they beat Rodney King. That was something that we read about as well in Race Matters by Cornel West, and in Have Black Lives Ever Mattered by Mumia Abu-Jamal. And I think that it's important to remember some of these specific moments in history in this country, and so that way you can be able to identify how often some of these things have happened, and the lack of accountability that these institutions that we're speaking about has had throughout history. So here, let's keep reading. One afternoon, JR's cousin G-Ball and other Castle crew members noticed a strange white man nearly skipping toward them across the blacktop known as the Killing Field. He appeared as a ghostly apparition in a tattered old dress, but less Candyman than Casper. The middle-aged man was chubby and balding, wearing thick, cheap glasses, a child's grin smeared across his ruddy face, and waving his arms like a semaphore. Quote, "Police," end quote, an underage lookout yelled. But anyone with sense could tell that this was no cop. What had looked like a dress from a distance was a sort of monk's habit sewn together from dozens of strips of faded blue jeans. The frock was cinched at the waist, and a rosary and a large wooden cross hung from the man's belt. The hobo priest was shouting, quote, "Bud, buddy," end quote, lengthening the last syllable as if they were all lifelong friends. To their surprise, he gave each of them the gangster disciple's handshake. He was Brother Bill, he said. He was with Catholic Charities, and he would be spending time in the neighborhood. Brother Bill showed up the next day, and most days after that. He'd wander between the buildings, sometimes well past midnight, always stopping by 1117 North Cleveland to spend time with the Castle crew, asking about their families or small talking about the Bulls or the Bears. He never told people to stop selling drugs or to give up their guns. Quote, "Hey, Brother Bill," end quote, residents would greet him from the ramps and playgrounds. But at the sound of gunfire, whenever there was violence, he hurried to it. He would position himself between the opposing gangs in the open field and blacktops or alongside one of the towers or in the lobbies, hoping that his presence might stop the shooting. At the very least, he wanted to give the gang members an excuse to end a fight. Sometimes bullets zipped by so close that he could hear the vacuum of air as they passed, the metallic taste of fear lingering in his mouth. Brother Bill believed that he was protected by God's shield, and he could be harmed only if that protection was lifted. As he neared a gunfight, he said a divine voice would instruct him, "Stand here." It was in those moments, with the surge of adrenaline, the rush of having survived, that he felt a sense of grace. He was fulfilling his purpose, witnessing to save lives. There was a night when he came upon 10 teenagers outside one of the white high-rises on Division Street. They were battering another teen with sticks. Brother Bill picked up the boy, shielding him with his body. One of the stick wielders said, quote, "Brother Bill, you shouldn't do that," end quote. Another of the attackers disagreed, quote, "Nah, that's what he's supposed to do," end quote. Years earlier, in 1980, Bill Thomas was deliberating over 2 job offers, and he dropped into a Ukrainian Catholic church in Chicago to contemplate his options. While he knelt before the altar, he recalled the light in the church suddenly changed and the room seemed to spin as if on its axis. His line of sight had nothing to settle on save an illuminated portrait of Christ on the wall above him. And then Thomas heard Jesus. "Love. You are forbidden to do anything other than that." The disembodied voice commanded, "I'll lead. You follow." Thomas had no doubt that the Son of God had spoken to him. He'd experienced a miracle. Even the Catholic Church would later recognize that he'd undergone a genuine locution, a private revelation. But he didn't take himself seriously enough to believe he had a higher calling. He assumed Jesus had made a mistake. Not long after, while lying awake in bed, he felt Christ standing before him, uttering, "You will have me. You will be poor." Bill responded, quote, "Poor? Wow, not too tempting. Yuck, such a deal," end quote. Christ went on, "You must forgive everyone, everything." Eventually, Bill stopped resisting. He took a vow of poverty and volunteered at one of the poorest parishes in all of Chicago, St. Malachi's. The near West Side parish had over the years catered to Irish families, Italians, and Slavs. It now served the residents of the Henry Horner Homes, a public housing complex of 19 buildings. Alex Kotlowitz's 1991 nonfiction bestseller, There Are No Children Here, was about 2 brothers, Lafayette and Pharaoh Rivers, living in the Horner homes with their mother, LaJoe, and their siblings. Quote, "Twice in May, LaJoe herded the children into the hallway, where they crouched against the walls to avoid stray bullets." Kotlowitz writes, quote, "Pharaoh's stutter worsened so that he barely talked and stayed mostly to himself. He continued to shake whenever he heard a loud noise, Okay, trying to get this page turned. Lafayette told his mother, quote, "Mama, if we don't get away, someone's going to end up dead. I feel it," end quote. A great number of the young men Thomas came to know at Horner were members of gangs. He found that he liked talking to them. He'd labor at the parish in the morning and walk the housing development from noon until late at night. Sometimes it was difficult to forgive murderers, people who could fire indiscriminately into a crowd or sell drugs to a young mother at her wit's end. But forgiveness, as Christ had instructed him, was the key to the work. By the 80s, Chicago's Cardinal Joseph Bernardin felt the Catholic Church needed to do more to address the violence afflicting the city's parishes, and he asked Thomas to carry out his work with gang members in other parts of the city as well. Thomas had no calling for the priesthood, so he couldn't be a father. Officially, he would be a consultant with Catholic charities, earning a small stipend, with the church allowing him to go by, quote, Brother Bill, end quote, a brother in the sense of his union with all people. The place associated most readily with violence in Chicago was Cabrini-Green, so that's where Brother Bill was sent. He modeled his habit of stitched denim after the sewn rags worn by St. Francis of Assisi. It looked like the oldest pair of jeans you owned. The denim turned white with wear, tassel-tailed sections going to holes and then patched, the many parts pieced together like a Frankenstein monster. He could be a holy man or a homeless man. He wore a homemade scapular as well, and his frock had a hood that he never donned, since he felt it looked too much like the Ku Klux Klan. The archdiocese approved the outfit, almost as a kindness to the gang members. Thomas stood out even late at night at public housing. No one would shoot him by accident. The longer Thomas did this work, the less comfortable he was leaving the land. He stayed at Cabrini-Green or Henry Horner or Rockwell Gardens until 2 o'clock a.m., waking for morning mass and then repeating the cycle day after day. Over the years, he saved the programs from each of the funerals he'd attended as Brother Bill. His stacks growing from 10 to 80 to 130. He rarely slept, and he berated himself when someone was hurt in his absence, as if he could have done more. He should have been in the stairwell, in the elevator, on Oak Street, the row houses, Stanton Park, on the blacktop, by the L tracks, in front of the Rock, outside the Lower North Center. Okay, that brings us to a changing of the passage within this chapter. And we're just about done with this chapter, but we're not going to be able to finish it this episode. All right. I don't really got too much of a reflection for that last passage that we read. But I would just encourage people to go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily if you haven't before. And if by the time this comes out, there's future episodes out, I would encourage people to go listen to those future episodes of Rockford Reading Daily as well. And we will be back tomorrow with another episode. Talk to you then.